Hello, manic.mercurian, with a birth chart reading. Before I get into the actual reading, I did want to thank you for allowing me to post this publicly, and thank you as well for your patience. I know this took me a longer time than usual to get this out, so thank you. And thanks for getting this reading. Readings like this are what allow me to keep posting new content, and they're what keep the channel going. So for anyone else who would like a reading like this, if you're interested, you can check out my website, manic.mercurian.net, or you can email me at manic.mercurian@gmail.com, and all of that information is in the description below. Okay, so for this reading, this will be for Saturday, June 24th, 1995 at 9:18 a.m. in Bandung, Indonesia. So this means that you have Sun in Cancer, Moon in Taurus, with Leo rising. And the first thing I notice is that, some people relate more to their sun signs than others. Some charts will have, a whole lineup with the sun in that sign, and some not so much. For you, you do have Sun in Cancer, but there's really nothing else. There's not much else going on there. So, while Sun in Cancer would typically be described as very emotional, I think that's the most defining trait of the very strong emotion, very much knowing what you feel, oscillating between different moods and things like that. You generally wouldn't relate to much of the archetypes that we're familiar with strong Cancer energy, because you don't have any other planets there. There aren't a lot of planets in the water signs in general. And, really a lot of the focus is on Moon in Taurus and then Venus and Mercury in Gemini. So really, rather than relying a lot on emotion and intuition and things like that, it looks like you'd actually be very logical. You like to keep things rational. You like to use the mind, the intellect. You like to analyze. Again, that's because of the Mercury in Gemini. Mercury's in domicile in Gemini, so this means, while Mercury has to do with how we think and communicate, it's very intellectual. It's the intellect, the energy of the intellect. And being in Gemini, this means you are very intellectual. You're very analytical. Combining this with Taurus Moon, this is a very practical placement. This means that you can be very direct. You like to prefer a kind of no-nonsense approach. You don't want to mess around too much with things that are not worthwhile. You probably have, very excellent, very grounded common sense and pragmaticism about you. You really don't like to get too sappy or too emotional, too lost in, you like to make sure that what you're investing in emotionally and mentally, makes sense, and that it's practical, if that makes sense, rather than partaking or indulging in, overly emotional experiences. Does that make sense? So while most Sun in Cancer people would be described as highly emotional and, using a kind of emotional intuition to navigate the world, you may relate to this a little bit, but for the most part, again, you're more relying on your intellectual senses rather than emotional most of the time. What else? Moon in Taurus, Moon is exalted in Taurus, so this means that emotionally you're actually very steady, very stable, very consistent, very even keel. Again, this is a little bit different than how most people with Sun in Cancer would experience reality, because typically when you have Sun in Cancer or any placement that indicates strong emotion, there's usually kind of an oscillation. Emotions are not, I think intrinsically emotions are not stable. They're sort of constantly changing, and that's why they're represented by the water element. But again, there's not a lot of water in your chart. It's really more focused, in my mind, it's more focused on Gemini and Taurus. So again, more air and earth, these are the more rational, more detached elements. You can actually be very detached. You can be very practical, even to the point of not taking into account the emotions of yourself or others. You prefer to focus on variables that can be quantified. You prefer to keep things logical, rational, measured, etc. So you can be, speculating based off your placements. It looks like you could be very rational, and you can, with Mercury and Gemini, there would definitely be a love of learning, a focus on learning. and you crave diversity. You would want many different experiences. However, we're combining that again with Moon and Taurus, which is all about stability. You emotionally, you naturally tend to operate from a very grounded, practical level, which, this keeps you from embracing extremes of emotion. This keeps you centered, generally speaking. So combining Mercury and Gemini with Moon and Taurus makes you very centered, very rational, very practical. Also, both of these placements are in domicile or exaltation. So Mercury's in Gemini. Mercury rules Gemini. Moon is in Taurus, where it's exalted. So this means that these placements are very easy for you to deal with, and it's very easy for others to deal with you and understand you because of these placements. So, in other words, Mercury in Gemini indicates that the way you analyze things and the way you think it comes from a very rational, you do it in a very rational type of way. So others can easily understand you because the way you communicate is how one would expect you to communicate. Does that make sense? You communicate in a clear way, and you probably have some natural ability when it comes to reading, writing, articulating, things of that nature. And because Mercury's in the 10th house, you tend to do this in a very public way. So in your career, in public, in any kind of public situation, online, etc., you're seen for your intellect. You're seen as intelligent. Others can understand this part of you very readily. Same with, how you are emotionally. Emotionally, you're very grounded, very practical, with Moon exalted in Taurus. So this is another area where, others find it very easy to deal with you and to understand you. Emotionally, because you are very stable emotionally, very consistent. I think this makes it very easy for others to embrace and understand you. Because deep down, you're not constantly changing. Deep down, your identity is solid. You have a sort of strong willedness about you deep down. On the outside, you may be constantly changing and learning new things. You may be articulating things in a different way. You have a very kind of nimble mind or a nimble way of analyzing things. But again, deep down, when it comes to the core personality, that remains pretty consistent with you. So again, this is just something that makes it easy for others to understand you, and others would generally appreciate your company because when placements are in domicile or exaltation, it makes you easy to understand, easy to embrace, and it makes you, these are favorable placements. So it means that you don't really have to develop these a whole lot to be proficient in them. In other words, Mercury has to do with the mind, Moon has to do with emotions and the core personality. Because these are both situated in really easy placements for you, you can actually be very skilled with learning new things and communicating, as well as skilled, I guess you could say, when it comes to your emotional baseline. All of these areas come very naturally for you, and others see this in a very visible type of way. Does that make sense? So, generally speaking, others would find it easy to understand you. I think this is strengthened even more by your Leo rising. The rising represents how we approach things, how we start things, and it's sort of the first impression we give off to others. Because your rising is in Leo, this means that you tend to prefer to start things in a very direct way. You can find it comfortable to be the initiator. What else? Leo rising would indicate that you start things in a way that's not really direct but very straightforward. You're not afraid to be the leader, the one stepping out, of the boundaries, the one, not afraid to be different or to be independent, unique, the one to show your authenticity, to show yourself and your uniqueness. Excuse me. Also, again, kind of jumping around again a bit, your inner planets are mostly all at the top of your chart here. So Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus are all clustered loosely around the midheaven. And so this is the most public part of the chart. This means that you thrive when it comes to public areas, work, public, online areas. things like that, you naturally would thrive with. You thrive with attention. You can be the center of attention. You can be in the spotlight. You can handle these situations pretty naturally, really. This is sort of your forte, I guess you could say. So others see you not only as being intelligent, but they see you as being emotionally stable and grounded, and there would generally be kind of charisma that comes with these placements, a likability. Others feel that they can understand you and relate to you. And really, Sun and Cancer adds to this as well. Sun and Cancer, although there are no other placements there is some emotion there. So this is a potentially really charismatic placement as well, especially in combination with your other placements, because Sun and Cancer is familiar. Others feel that you are familiar to them, even if you may actually not be familiar to them. Others may feel like they already know you. They feel comfortable around you. You are not intimidating. You know what I mean? Others feel that you are non-threatening, and so others may open up to you very readily because of not only Sun and Cancer, but also your other placements and the way they're configured in your chart. You come across in a way that is strong, confident, intelligent, stable, but not too intimidating as well. Okay, so there are a lot of strengths here in the way your chart is situated. Oftentimes, the way you have Sun and the inner planets and the moon clustered at the top of the chart, this is something that we often see with like celebrities' charts. Usually there'll be a cluster near the top of the chart like this. So, I'm not necessarily saying that you are literally a celebrity, but that type of energy, may not be something that's unfamiliar to you. Again, thriving in public situations, things like that. And it doesn't have to be so extreme as, being a celebrity or something like that. It could just be, you could use this in your day-to-day experience, being out in the world, being in public, things like that. Okay, let's kind of jump around a bit here. You have South Node in 9th House Taurus. Again, this adds a lot of stability for sure. And this has to do with past life experiences. We're going to talk more about that in the next chapter here. But really briefly before we get into that, Mars in Virgo adds a lot of ambition too. So really, as we get deeper in your chart here, I think it's pretty clear that you have your placements are sort of spread out in different energies. They are well-rounded, let's just say. So you have the emotional intelligence of Sun and Cancer, but then the intellectual fluidity of Mercury and Venus and Gemini, but then also the stability and groundedness of Taurus Moon, and then with the ambition of Mars and Virgo. So really, all these placements are kind of contributing something very different, and it makes you well-rounded. It makes you generally, when you have placements that are spread out like this, it makes the chart less extreme. So you may have less extreme strengths, but also less extreme weaknesses. You can thrive in a variety of different areas. So I'm not sure whether you'd say that's good or bad. I think that would be favorable though, for sure. And then Leo rising too, you have that bit of fire, especially when it comes to approaching things. That that fire, that charisma, that energy, that can be really great with anything involving initiation or being a leader as well. Okay, but let's get a little bit deeper into the chart and talk about your past life experiences. We'll talk about your upbringing and then major challenges in this life, and then where you are likely going from there. So for having to do with past life information and things of that nature, I look mostly to the South Node. For you, again, that is in 9th House Taurus. And I do think it's interesting that you have not only South Node in Taurus, but also Moon and Midheaven. So there's a lot of focus there for you. I would go as far as to say that, again, to me, the chart is more focused on Taurus and Gemini than it is any other sign. Okay, so South Node in Taurus, that indicates that in a past life, you had to be extremely focused on consistency. So much so that you may have had to pass up all other opportunities. You couldn't really grow or expand because you had to do one thing. You had to be extremely reliable, consistent, predictable, you had to behave in a very responsible type of way. So exactly what you were doing, it's hard for me to narrow down beyond that. But that's the main energy or archetype that I can see. It does look like it was very extreme for you because, again, because you have not only South Node in Taurus but also the Moon there as well. This just strengthens these themes even more. So, in a past life or maybe multiple past lives, being extremely stable, extremely consistent, extremely predictable, doing one thing and being, specializing at it. So, for example, maybe being some kind of like health worker, doctor or nurse, having to be in exactly, one place at a certain time, doing exactly what you're supposed to at a certain time, every day, so others counted on you, I guess is what I'm getting at. So whether that would be doctor, nurse, or, even like a soldier or something else, whatever it was, others were counting on you to be extremely reliable, extremely consistent, extremely responsible, if that makes sense. So that is the energy that you carry over into this life. And it's so strong that part of you, if there is one area of your chart that looks extreme to me, that would be the one thing. In this life, there are many strengths that come from that. I think others would easily recognize you as being very, others can count on you. Others can rely on you. And you're very independent as well. There's a lot of independence that comes from this as well because you aren't relying on other people. It's you tend to experience things the other way around. You don't rely on other people rely on you. That's just how it is. That's how it's most comfortable for you. That's what you're used to because that's what you've dealt with in past lives. And again, I just want to stress one more time the sheer level of consistency and pragmatism. All of this is good. These are really good traits in terms of, I think it's admirable that you can be so self-sufficient and so sturdy, so stable in yourself. Others, rely on you. You're responsible. You take care of yourself. All of that is really great. Okay. But this does come with some caveats. It does come with some challenges because in this life, the more you just stay with that archetype or that energy, the more it will actually lead to your downfall. This is probably something that you've already recognized in your life, that it may be difficult for you sometimes to branch out. And especially when it comes to intimacy, to relying on other people. You will, of course, you probably have already had experiences and of course will continue to have experiences in this life where it may be necessary to involve other people in what you're doing, whether that be emotionally, intimately, or it could be maybe with work, when it comes to partnerships or, collaborating with other people. These areas are not as innately comfortable for you. They're not as natural. You may not know exactly how to interact with other people when it comes to trusting other people, relying on other people, being emotionally vulnerable. Okay. A lot of this too has to do with communication. North Node is in 3rd house Scorpio. So again, it's all about balance. It's never, there's 2 points here. There's the South Node in 9th house Taurus and then the North Node in Scorpio 3rd house. So the South Node represents where you've come from. It's things that you're naturally already pretty good at, pretty skilled with, pretty familiar with, and then North Node represents the other side of things where you're less familiar with, but where you could have, where there's a lot of potential if you go in that direction. So in other words, it's not necessarily about running away from the stability that you have. It's good that you're so stable and responsible and self-sufficient. All of these are really excellent and admirable traits. But if you stay with that and only stay on your own and never rely on other people, it will lead to your downfall in this lifetime. You have to keep the positive of those traits, but also learn to incorporate, when is it appropriate to rely on other people? When will you need to do that? for the good of your work and for your personal relationships as well. Okay. Um, and this, it takes time. It will be a little bit difficult for you since, because Moon is also in Taurus, you're really, really, more comfortable with just doing things on your own, and again, that's okay to some extent, but, it'll just take time to get more comfortable with relying on other people, things of that nature. So I just want to put that out there, kind of just to confirm that, because again, I would speculate that you've already encountered this whole theme in your life by now. Sort of on that similar vein, but kind of switching gears here, another area that indicates major challenges for you is, of course, Saturn. So wherever Saturn is in our charts indicates an area that we tend to deal with a lot of challenges or potential setbacks early in life, but we get better in this area over time. Okay, so for you, you have Saturn in Pisces, and this is a little bit similar because, Saturn is in a water sign, just like the North Node is. This shows, again, kind of going off of what I was saying in the beginning, you prefer to just keep things very rational, very logical. You prefer to intellectualize things. And again, all that's really well and good. There is a lot of strength in that. You have a lot of skill and innate talent in these areas, innate ability. But Saturn in Pisces is showing that you find it more difficult or more challenging to just kind of relax. Let the chips fall where they may. Just accept things as they are and feel things emotionally. Does that make sense? And also, Saturn and Pisces has a lot to do with relaxing and experiencing slower states of mind. So, meditation, prayer, relaxation, deep sleep. You may have challenges in all of these areas. All of these areas may not be comfortable or familiar to you, especially early in life. I find that many or even most people who have Saturn and Pisces tend to struggle. They have sleep issues. So you may have insomnia, sleep apnea, issues with dreams, things of that nature. And this is this is important because it's not just about sleep. Of course, sleep in itself is very important. Getting good rest is necessary for all other parts of life, pretty much. But this is really important too, because accessing these slower states of mind, resting, relaxing, getting good sleep, these things are what will allow you to form your intuition, to develop spiritually as well. So it's not just sleep. This is more than just that. It's spirituality. It's spiritual development, okay, and emotional development as well. So in all of these areas, they will start out uncomfortable for you, challenging, and they will generally become more comfortable for you over time. You're actually approaching what is likely to be a major time of potential challenges in these areas, but also potential growth as well, because you are basically on the eve of your Saturn return. Most people experience this, let's just say, between ages 27 and 30, or about there. This is when the transiting Saturn approaches your natal Saturn, and right now, as I'm speaking, Saturn has just entered Pisces of actually March of 2023, and it will continue to be in Pisces for the next 2.5 years or thereabouts. So during this time, transiting Saturn is passing your natal Saturn. This means that all of these issues when it comes to, resting, relaxing, spirituality, sleep, what else? Also, spirituality, branching out into things that are, weird or strange or unusual, maybe, or hard to understand. In all of these areas, these are things that may become much more relevant over the next few years. And you may have situations in your life which require more responsibility of you, more self-awareness in these areas. And there may be some kind of crisis or challenge, involving sleep, rest, spirituality, which require you to face these things basically, and, ideally rise up to the challenge. Okay. And, typically that's the trajectory. Typically we would, rise up to the challenge and reach a new level of maturity, self-awareness, responsibility, and especially when it comes to long-term plans, goals, long-term for you, long-term spirituality, long-term sleep, rest, things of that nature. And by confronting these things and rising up to the challenge, you grow and become more mature. And and then going forward into your 30s, 40s, and beyond, you'll naturally, excel more and more in these areas. What was once very challenging, very uncomfortable for you, will become easier, usually, because you've gotten better, because you've gotten wiser, more mature, more capable in these areas. Okay? And there is a lot of potential with displacement as well. So by going through those trials and tribulations, coming from a place of not having that sense of inner peace, spirituality, rest, by coming from a place of not having those things, and then eventually, ideally, creating those things for yourself, it makes you that much more of an expert. It makes you that much more of a person who knows the ins and outs of these things, and you have the potential to become a master in those areas. All right, so definitely a lot of challenging stuff, but the way your chart is configured, I don't think this would be too difficult for you. And I always have to say that, just the very fact that you are interested in astrology and you're seeking a reading, to me shows that you're interested in self-improvement and, understanding these types of things. So as long as you have that intention, it is, of course, possible. You don't have to develop in any of these areas if you don't want to. But to me, looking at your chart and, just speculating, it's not impossible. It's not something that can't be done. And if anything, I would go as far as to say that the natural trajectory would be for you to master these areas. So hopefully that's inspiring, I guess. But yeah, generally speaking, North Node in Scorpio, Saturn in Pisces, the challenge for you, ironically, because you have Sun in Cancer, the challenge for you is accepting emotion, accepting the unpredictability of life. A lot of that has to do with other people, but it also has to do with yourself and your inner subconscious, those more subconscious states of mind. I think what's much easier for you to deal with is logic, reason, analysis, these areas that are more predictable, and dealing with yourself, handling life yourself. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, let's jump around and talk about your childhood a little bit, your upbringing. So with Sun in Cancer and Moon in Taurus, these signs are sextile to one another. They have a harmonious aspect to each other. This would indicate that your parents or whoever you grew up with, whoever raised you, they had some level of consistency or similarity, at least enough for you to have some kind of consistency. So there's a certain level of confidence that comes from your childhood because of this kind of consistency that you had. You at least knew what was expected from you. And if you did grow up with both parents, your chart indicates that they would have had at least a little bit in common. They would have, generally speaking, gotten along well together, let's just say. South Node in Taurus, again, it tells us not only about your past lives, it also says a little bit about what kind of child you were, because, again, that's kind of a major energy that you have starting out this life. So South Node in Taurus indicates that you would have been a pretty practical, pretty stable kid, someone that wasn't, impulsive or erratic, someone who wasn't overly emotional, like many children are, I guess you could say. You would have been the same type of stability that you have as an adult, you likely would have had as a child as well. Very stable, even keel. There was a certain level of practicality that you have always had. However, on the flip side, Something a little different is your IC. That's that little black triangle at the bottom of the chart. It indicates your home, your foundation, where you come from, and it too pertains a lot to what kind of child you were. And that is in Scorpio, so that would indicate that there was some level of conflict or chaos in your upbringing. And typically, what happens is that as a way of, well, let's just say, children often will rebel from their upbringing, let's just say. And for you, it almost works backward because, you felt that you grew up in a chaotic environment, and so that your way of rebelling is by creating structure and order. You're seeking that practicality, you're seeking that stability. So your way of rebelling would actually be by being productive and being orderly. So that, again, that's kind of backward than how we would typically see it, of rebelling in a chaotic way away from structure. For you, it was the other way around. You were rebelling by creating structure and order and discipline, wanting that discipline and structure, I guess, out of the chaos, I guess you could say. But because you do have Pluto conjunct the IC as well, it does look like there may have been some kind of really intense chaos. So I know that's a little bit contradictory. On the one hand, it looks like your parents would have been pretty stable, there's some kind of harmony there. But at the same time, Pluto conjunct IC in Scorpio indicates some type of trauma, chaos, something that pushed you to evolve, something that, like, there was kind of this grinding restlessness that was constantly pushing you. There could have also been some kind of paranoia or fear in your environment, or maybe with your mother. I'm just going to leave that at that. I know that's a little bit vague, but that's kind of the extent that I see, so I'll just let you do with that what you will, I guess. Because the sun and moon are, they're both pretty high in the sky, they're both in signs that are decently strong, I would say both your parents likely would have been pretty present in your life. Saturn is direct as well. That's another indicator for that too. So yeah, it looks like both your parents would be very present, especially your mother, I would say. And yeah, again, there's a harmoniousness there, but then there's also this intense trauma, intensity in general in your upbringing. And this, I would speculate that this may have come out in certain types of events. So to put it in astrological terms, whenever your Pluto conjunct ISC would be triggered by some kind of transit or aspect, then you may have had some kind of very intense traumatic event in your upbringing. But with those exceptions, it looks like your upbringing would be pretty favorable, pretty harmonious, generally speaking. One last thing about that too, so because you have Leo rising, often with Leo rising, from your childhood, you may have been expected to be very outgoing, very confident. That's where some of these tendencies later in life kind of come from. At least that's where they likely would have come from. You may have felt like you were in the spotlight as a child, or felt like you were put on display, and so you had to be captivating, you had to be charismatic, and again, that's where those strengths, that's where those traits come from. This is something that you embody much more so later in life. Okay, let's talk about your career a little bit. What would you be comfortable doing career-wise and in public? So typically, midheaven indicates the way you relate to your career and your reputation. And your midheaven is in Taurus, so this says that you come across very stable, very consistent, and this is very true. This is how you often are. This is how much of your personality is, because your moon is in Taurus as well. So deep down, we already talked about how you are emotionally grounded, very practical, very stable, and others see this in a very public way. This is how you come across in public, online, in public, at work, things of that nature. So really, I think you can use this, in many different industries, almost any type of industry. Whatever you tend to do career-wise, you would want to do for the long term, though. Usually there's, that consistency applies to what you do for work. So whatever it is you do, you tend to prefer to really just, stick through it and, stick with one career, one industry for many years and really specialize in that industry. But branching out beyond that, I like to kind of go over your some of your strengths at this point and how you could use those. So we already talked about how you speculating based on your chart looks like you're very intellectual. You could handle a lot of information. You can handle maybe something having to do with relaying information. Mercury is in the 10th house, so this would indicate maybe someone who is a journalist, reporter, writer, something having to do with reading, writing, teaching. Could be a teacher of some sort. Something having to do with you accumulating information and then dispersing that information. So teacher, reader, writer, journalist, editor, something intellectual, something with information or words, things of that nature. And then the other thing too is, of course, I think, I already touched on how you have a lot of charisma. You can handle, attention very well. You can be in a public position and thrive with that. Looks like you have some leadership capability as well. Not only from the Leo rising, which would indicate, you coming across in an energetic, very straightforward way, but also because you have multiple positions that are exalted, you have that charisma. Others perceive you in a positive way. They feel that they can understand and relate to you and respect you. So I do think you could thrive when it comes to either a very public position or maybe some type of leadership position. And honestly, it looks like you have a chart where you could thrive with many different things, because all these strengths, all these traits that I'm listing really don't sway me toward one industry or another. Of course, I think with the exception of the intellectual, maybe something intellectual having to do with teaching, researching, being a leader in that type of area. But other than that, it's hard to say, because many of these strengths you could apply to many different areas. Definitely something having to do with speaking, communicating, speaking, writing, something of that nature for sure. And I would add too, Mars and Virgo, looks like you're very ambitious. So whatever you do for work, you would have, a really strong work ethic and really stick to it and be very dedicated and consistent. So it looks like you'd be good at whatever you do. It's just hard to say exactly what that would be, because of the nature of your charts. I could see you either going in a direction having to do with maybe using I'm not sure if your intellectual ability is more in the realm of speaking, and you could use your charisma in that area to be some kind of speaker, salesperson, someone, in that kind of public arena. Or if you go the other way and go the more intellectual route, going more in the route of maybe writing or something of that nature. But if I had to try to narrow it down for you, I would think could be excellent with sales or journalism, teaching, editing. It's as far as I could kind of narrow it down, I guess. Okay, and then going right along here, let's talk about the kind of romantic sector of your life. So what kind of person would you be attracted to, and how do I see the ideal relationship working for you, things of that nature. So Mars in Virgo shows that you can be a little bit vanilla sexually, let's just say. So you may be more compatible in that area with someone who is practical, down to earth, modest. You wouldn't mind someone who is not overly kind of gushing. Someone who isn't super strong with, displays of affection, I think you may not mind so much. So someone who's more kind of steady and practical, someone who shows their affection with things that they do, like for example, someone who has a lot of Virgo placements, rather than getting flowers or surprising you or something, they would want to cook you a nutritious meal or something like that, something very practical that is supporting you in a long-term type of way. Does that make sense? So that's more the type of affection that you would be attracted to. So potentially someone with Virgo placements, or maybe other Earth placements as well, like Taurus or Capricorn. That's what you'd be most kind of attracted to, if that makes sense. Someone practical, stable, responsible, someone maybe intellectual as well. And taking into account your Venus as well. Venus is in Gemini, Mars is in Virgo. Both of these are ruled by Mercury. In other words, so both of the placements having to do with your attraction and your, what you're attracted to, what you desire. Both the placements having to do with love, sex, romance. These are both really intellectual, kind of detached signs. So this would indicate that you would be like sapiosexual, some people call it. So rather than attracted to someone just based off their looks, the most important thing for you by far is the intellect. You really, really want someone intelligent, well thought out, someone, maybe educated, someone who knows a lot about many different subjects. That by far more than anything is what determines your attraction. Okay. So you really want someone who has maybe someone you can learn from or have really deep conversations with, someone intelligent, basically. So this could literally be with someone who has Virgo or Gemini placements. It could also be someone else who has, maybe other Earth or air placements. What else? Or maybe someone who has a strong Mercury in their chart as well. Venus and Gemini also, some people say that this is a promiscuous or slutty placement. And really, I would give a kind of deeper perspective on that. I would say Venus and Gemini indicates that you require a lot of stimulation and variety romantically. So some people would get that from maybe multiple people romantically, but you definitely could be very satisfied with a very committed partnership, but you would need someone who is multifaceted. Okay, you want someone who has different sides to them, someone complex, someone a little bit complicated, someone again very intelligent and very well researched, let's just say. So this could definitely be someone with strong Gemini energy, or again, like I said, strong Mercury energy in their chart as well. We'd have to look at charts of other people to see how well they fit with what's going on here in your chart, of course. But just going off your chart, I definitely think someone with strong Gemini placements you'd be very attracted to, because they would fulfill those things. They would be multifaceted. They would know much about many different subjects, things of that nature. So someone with strong Gemini placements is a potential candidate. Also, because you have Mercury in Gemini, someone with strong Gemini energy you would be able to relate to and communicate with very naturally as well, and you'd also be very attracted to them too. So Gemini, or maybe Libra or Aquarius, those could be definitely attractive for you. Any of these signs are air signs, so they'll all be kind of detached, intellectual, and what else? Multifaceted to some extent. But let's talk about your ascendant-descendant axis. This is something that not a lot of people focus on astrologically, but it's something that has a lot to do with your long-term compatibility. So because you have Leo rising, that has to do with your identity, who you are in the relationship. This would indicate, to me, it indicates that you would be comfortable being the initiator. You'd be the one who, maybe makes the first approach, makes the first advances, kind of develops the relationship more so. And Leo rising also indicates that you're very strong-willed. You're not gonna change yourself for anyone. Who you are is who you are, and that's pretty much that. What you're wanting is someone else who is strong-willed as well, but in a more kind of detached way. Um, in other words, because Descendant is an Aquarius, that represents the best type of, the energy that you would most naturally work with in a long-term capacity. So Descendant and Aquarius, this means that people with strong Aquarius placements you would naturally work well with in a partnership. What you expect from them, what you kind of need from them, and the way you operate would go hand in hand with the way they operate. Someone with strong Aquarius placements will be detached, intellectual, strong-willed, consistent, and they would be very comfortable with you taking the lead because, although they can be very strong-willed, they prefer, although they can be strong-willed, they can also be sort of flexible, I guess, and detached. And because of that detachment, they are more comfortable with someone else taking the lead, if that makes sense. So definitely a strong potential for compatibility with Aquarius. Another reason why I'm leaning toward Aquarius as well is because I tend to love matching the fixed signs with one another. You have Moon in Taurus, so you can be very strong-willed. You have that very stable consistency deep down that we talked about earlier. And someone who has strong Aquarius placements, they will also be strong-willed and consistent, but in a different way than how you are. They'll be a little bit more spontaneous. They'll be a little bit more out there. While you are maybe a little bit more mainstream, you're well understood, well accepted by others, accepted by the mainstream. Someone with Aquarius placements will be a little bit more rebellious, a little bit more counterculture, a little bit less understood maybe. And I think these differences can actually drive attraction. That tends to be my philosophy. And this philosophy comes from a place, these are things that I've observed astrologically, that it's actually the differences between us that drives the attraction. You need enough contrast, enough tension to drive the attraction, but enough in common for there to be mutual respect and understanding. Okay, and with combining fixed signs like this, so for instance, because you have Taurus Moon and Leo Rising, if you were to work with someone with Aquarius placements, you'll both be similar in the sense that you are strong-willed and consistent. And so I think from, recognizing each other's strong will and consistency, there's a lot of mutual respect and understanding there. But again, there's enough difference that there's something captivating, there's something driving the attraction. And, there's enough differences there to keep things interesting. So definitely someone with strong Aquarius placements, I think that would be very natural for you and very attractive for you. It would also fit with it would fit with many of your placements. Someone with Aquarius energy is going to be not only strong-willed and consistent, but also intelligent, intellectual, detached, and this would be attractive for you. You could have, those deep conversations that you're really craving. You could maybe learn something from them and vice versa. So if I had to just go with one sign over any other, I would say Aquarius. But also the other air signs as well, Gemini or Libra. Libra, maybe to a lesser extent. I do tend to find that those with Cancer Sun can often be drawn toward Libra people. And this, I think, gives sort of mixed results usually, because I think on the surface level, Cancer and Libra, especially when they're first meeting each other, it can seem like they have more in common than they actually do. Both prefer to initiate sort of indirectly. Both can really thrive with social interactions in general. Both can be very sociable. Both enjoy meeting new people. Both, like I said, are prefer to keep things kind of subtle or indirect. But once you form a deeper, more intimate relationship, I think a lot of differences can emerge, mostly because Cancer is so emotional, so sensitive. Libra is very detached. It's really not very emotional at all. So I think these signs can tend to clash over time from some of those differences. So Libra could work. I'm mostly looking at Gemini or Aquarius for you, though, or maybe a combination of those signs. And then let's just go through the other elements really quickly here. So we already touched on Virgo. Virgo, it definitely looks like there would be some attraction there for you with those who have Virgo placements. Usually, though, with the sign of your Mars, there often is a lot of attraction, but there can also be competitiveness. There could be an edginess, some tension. So there could be attraction, but there could also be the potential for, fighting later or, tension. So Virgo, there could be compatibility there. Virgo does trine your moon, so you would have a lot in common with them. You would both be stable, grounded, practical. So that could be something for you. I definitely don't think it's as strong as a candidate as Aquarius or Gemini, though. And then the other Earth signs as well. Taurus, you have Moon and South Node in Taurus, so excuse me. Other people who have strong Taurus energy as well, I would say that you would mostly be, this looks more like a friendship dynamic to me, because if, let's just say, of course, someone else is going to have placements all over their chart just like you, but just going by sign, though, if someone just had all their placements in Taurus, you would relate to them very well. The nature of the dynamic would be familiar. It would be easy. You would already feel like you know each other right off the bat. So that would be a really easy, positive dynamic in that regard. The reason why I say this would be more of a friendship, though, is because it would almost be too stable, too easy, too familiar. There wouldn't be any edginess there. It wouldn't be complementary in nature. So neither of you would have anything to give to the other one because you would have so much in common. So, that's where I say this would really be ideal for a friendship, not so much for a romantic connection. I do think, though, if someone has major Taurus placements in combination with other placements, that's where it gets a little bit complicated. Then I could see a romantic dynamic happening. So, for example, if someone had strong Taurus placements with Aquarius placements or Gemini, that could be a really great setup for you compatibility-wise. But Taurus on its own, it would be a friendship. It would be stable, familiar, peaceful. The worst part of it would be it could be a little bit boring. And then Capricorn would be a little bit similar. Capricorn is similar to Virgo and Taurus. It's also earthy, practical, responsible, etc. So I just don't think that would be an energy that you are interested in. It's not, you have Venus and Gemini, so you like to keep things light. You like to keep things detached. You don't want to get too serious with relationships. You like to develop them kind of slowly because you're approaching them from a more detached way. Capricorn is going to really want something to invest in, pretty much right away. It's all about the long term. It's very mature energy. So I don't think that would be something that would be very engaging for you. You want to keep things intellectual, detached, kind of playful. I don't think Capricorn would fulfill that for you at all. And then talking about the fire and water elements, the fire signs are interesting for you because you actually have no fire planets at all that I can see. Oh, there is Jupiter in Sagittarius, but with that exception, there's really not a whole lot going on in the fire signs. You do have ascendant in Leo as well. So when we lack an element, we do sometimes draw that out from other people. So in other words, you may seek people who are very charismatic, energetic, very forthright, people who can be, who can have very dominant, outgoing personalities, people who can be impulsive, spontaneous, fiery, people with placements in Leo, Sagittarius, or Aries. This could be very captivating for you because it's representing something that you don't have a lot of in your chart. And so, this can make things more attractive. There's so much difference there. It's exotic. It's, it's different. It's unusual. It's something we're not used to. So on the one hand, this can drive a lot of attraction, be very attractive. And it can be very mutually beneficial because both of you would be providing something for the other that each of you lacks. So they could help you, to show you how to live a more spontaneous energetic lifestyle, and you could help to sort of stabilize them, I guess you could say. However, the other way this could work, though, is that you would have so much different that, it would be very difficult to maintain a long-term intimate relationship. I think this dynamic would be better for shallower relationships, generally speaking, like a friendship or acquaintance, because then you could still benefit from your differences without having to, you know, without having to put in all the effort it would take to maintain that mutual understanding and empathy for one another when you have such fundamentally different needs and interests and ways of living. So hopefully that makes sense. Leo in particular, you may find it easy to be friends with. Again, I really don't see this as a romantic connection for you unless there are other placements in the chart that are different. And then Sagittarius or Aries would just be very different, again, that could be very attractive for you, very stimulating, but I would say it would be very difficult to maintain, especially a close relationship. And then the water signs is going to be a similar deal. You don't have a lot of placements in the water signs, a little bit more than a fire, but still not a lot. So water signs, the most defining trait of the water signs, I would say, would be the heavy emotion. They're very emotional, very sensitive, very passionate, very creative. So again, they could represent an energy that you may be lacking in your life, and therefore this could drive some kind of attraction, and vice versa. You would be very stabilizing for them. Oftentimes people who have a lot of water in their charts are looking for someone very stable, such as yourself potentially. So there could be some mutual attraction there, but again, this is going to be really difficult to maintain, especially a long-term close relationship, because you're just so different. They are so emotional, and you tend to prefer to keep things rational, intellectual, logical. You would run the risk of them, there's the potential for misunderstandings and, hurt because of your differences. You may get tired of them being overly emotional, and they would perceive you as being, too cold or too detached or what have you, when really, it's just that you would be very different is all. So really, again, I would really look at Gemini or Aquarius. Those are by far, I think, the most compatible signs for you. Especially Aquarius or Gemini, either one really. Okay, yeah, but that's pretty much what I have to say about that. Let me just kind of tie up a couple loose ends here before we close the reading here. So something I find interesting is that you actually have Lilith in a tight conjunction to Mercury. Both are at 11 degrees Gemini. Lilith for me is hard to define. It is a sort of untamable feminine energy. So it's this essence in all of us that is wild and untamable, and wants to be completely free. And it can be very sexual. It can be very sexual energy, and it can be very dark energy as well. It's definitely not bad or evil, but it's just dark in the sense of being wild, untamable, even reckless. And this energy can come out during sort of critical crisis situations as well. So because this is conjunct your Mercury, and both are in the 10th house, both are in a very prominent, visible part of your chart, this means that intellectually you may be drawn towards subjects that are dark or wild in nature, and you may be drawn toward these things in a very public way. So you may enjoy, like, the way you actually communicate, or the things that you communicate about may be dark or wild in nature. You may have a kind of wild way of communicating, if that makes sense. And you may enjoy kind of bringing light to these dark areas. So subjects that may be taboo or, too weird or unusual for other people to talk about, you may enjoy kind of bringing these out and bringing them to the surface, if that makes sense. Yeah, and if you're curious about that, you can search, just search Mercury conjunct Lilith, things of that nature, because I'm definitely not an expert when it comes to Lilith placements, but that would be the extent that I could kind of speculate on those placements. And let's see, there was something else I wanted to talk about. just a few tidbits here. Mars in Virgo shows that you can be very orderly. The way you approach things, you naturally break down large projects into small tasks. And this is it's a very productive way of approaching things. This allows you to actually achieve quite a bit. You have this slow, steady, productive way of going about things. This is a really strong Mars placement in my view. This also indicates that you really need an orderly environment. It would really drive you crazy and potentially make you very frustrated to be in a very cluttered environment. So those who have Mars in Virgo tend to be neat freaks, or they tend to be kind of orderly. They tend to be organized, I guess you could say. I think that's mainly what I wanted to say. Saturn in 8th house is another place which indicates that you are very cautious or inhibited when it comes to partnerships, relying on other people, working with like contracts or financial agreements, involving other people. You would be very cautious of, which is good. It's good to have that healthy skepticism and that caution, but this can inhibit some of your relationships as well. So this is just something too that will become easier for, you may loosen up a little bit in this area over time as you learn, when it's safe to rely on other people, or when it's productive to do so, when it's appropriate to do so, I guess. Okay, but that's pretty much what I see with your chart. So let me know, of course, if you have any questions or feedback. I'm always open. If you want to ask me about anything, if you want me to elaborate, or if there's anything I didn't touch on, definitely feel free to let me know. And again, anyone else listening to this, if you want a reading, definitely just check out my website or send me an email. Okay, but thanks for this opportunity to read your chart, and hope that gives you something to think about. Hope you learned something or found that entertaining.